Okay, we are live. Joining me today, an extra special guest, Bernard J. Baars. Bernie, I wonder if you could say a little bit about who you are and what you do for those who may not know you.
Yes, I will. I'm Bernie Baars. I got started in the consciousness game a long time ago. And quite early on, I realized that we were looking at a very interesting time, a time of both convergence and divergence. And I had a chance to work with a research group at the time that included people, some of the pioneers in neural net, mathematics, which now, of course, has exploded in applications and in sophistication. We had one anthropologist who was very, very good. We had a great linguist, Len Talmy, who helped to found the field of cognitive linguistics. And we had me running around trying to make trouble and asking people about consciousness, which nobody wanted to talk about. It's quite amazing. And because it was intimidating, I think, and because, of course, we were coming out of a period of taboo. It's like sex in the Victorian age. The first person to talk about sex to Queen Victoria probably should have received a medal for doing that because the taboo is really quite pervasive. I think, at least in the company of ladies, for example, where it was not allowed. But then the men would get together, in the locker room. It wasn't actually a locker room, but a virtual locker room, and the same kind of taboo atmosphere prevailed on the topic of consciousness, even in the fields that you might expect to be directly concerned with consciousness, like medicine, for example, where you see people losing consciousness and regaining consciousness if you work hard, do the right thing all the time, and people tell you about their experience. And of course, they had this incredible neurosurgery tradition from Wilder Penfield, where Penfield studied epileptic patients who needed to have exploratory surgery because we didn't have any brain mapping at that time. So
Right.
surgeon would not know anything before he or she went in and took off the top of the cranium and found out whatever damage was visible at that time. And of course, you could not see the really very tiny damage that might be very, very important, but you did what you could. And so the Penfield group at the Montreal Neurological Institute studied 1,200 surgeries over a 30-year period. And they really discovered the mind-body, or the mind-brain connection, I should say, because they simply stimulated the body map on the left of the right-hand side of the body, or the left-hand side of the body. And people would tell them, I feel a touch on my hand. And of course, the hand was not being touched.
Right.
The hand region in the cortex was being touched. And that was, in retrospect, just a major discovery.
But I guess what you're saying is that even though they were doing that, they weren't connecting it explicitly to the notion of consciousness.
Well, Penfield knew. Penfield was actually, I think, a lay minister, Anglican minister, and he was obviously extremely well versed in philosophy of the time and traditional philosophy and so on, and of course in medicine as well. So I think he had quite a profound knowledge and a great deal of understanding of the ethical issues as well. I think Penfield was a very, very important pioneer in this field. But then there was a gap. Sort of nothing happened for about 30 years. And then finally, the computer became a tabletop instrument that everybody had, and inevitably everybody was forced to think, what is this gigantic brain doing in our heads that we don't fully understand, because it was so much of a black box. Of
Right.
course, there was so much we did not really grasp very well. And the idea came up that you've got this 100 billion neurons. They have a quarter of a quadrillion of synapses connecting to each other. There was a fair amount of knowledge, but we didn't have brain imaging. We had CAT scans, which were basically X-rays and so on. And then we had open brain surgeries, which were great adventures in the surprising and unexpected things that happened in the brains of patients who were medically justified to be operated on.
So, what years were you hanging around with these with this group and annoying them about consciousness? This is pre
Well,
1988.
1980 is a pretty good guess
Uh-huh.
because at that time, ARPANET was beginning, and ARPANET was the test bed really for the internet. And that meant that many people in computer science had realized that our initial conception of computers as being expensive and slow and hard to program and buggy, that concept, biology had figured that out for about 100 million years before
Yeah.
the brains that we see, or even longer. And somehow biology had made that work. And the way that biology evidently functioned was computation was much cheaper than anybody ever imagined. A biocomputation was much cheaper. So a bee will have, I think, about 1 million neurons in its brain. And its brain looks very different, of course. It's an insect brain, looks very different from the mammal brain, but nevertheless, it's capable of all kinds of intelligent processing. And if bees can do it, then humans have so much more neuronal mass sitting in their skulls that this must be, the thought was, it must be perhaps a society of brains. And the society metaphor, which is not the greatest in the world, but it's one of those useful crutches to discovery. It's a useful thing to kick around and do some loose thinking about and see if there's something very specific that you can hypothesize. And for me, the compelling hypothesis was the global workspace idea, which is essentially sort of like a game of charades where everybody is sitting in the room and nobody knows the answer, but everybody knows a little piece of the answer. So you can talk to each other and somebody can guess and you find out yes or no. And in the process, the entire group learns, and essentially everybody gets a chance to place a hypothesis on a shared workspace, and that's the global workspace. And so that implies that there are many intelligent participants, which there are in the brain at many, many levels of resolution, down to very small circuits and all the way up to, let's call it, entire hemispheres, just for the fun of it. And then some sort of hypothesis emerges, and there's sort of a vote that takes place, and one hypothesis is the most popular. And eventually the group settles on that one. So in a way, it's also a parliamentary metaphor, because you kind of have to have a debate and a vote, which is
Right.
one of the things that we do within ourselves. And this connects directly to higher order thought, because you've just defined it for me. that higher order thought is a debate about some previous mental content. So all that somehow came together at that particular time. I was able to state the hypotheses after working for a couple of years on trying to summarize the large amount of psychological evidence we had at that time, but not much brain evidence. And I was kind of forced into that hypothesis. I couldn't see any alternative, and that has not changed.
Yeah, interesting. I want to get to that, but I think on the sort of Victorian era point that you were making earlier, it is interesting because there was other work that was very closely related to consciousness going on. I mean, people were doing split brain, um, finding out things about split brains. Blind sight was being discovered. This is all well before the 90s. So even though in the 90s there was a sudden rekindling of interest in consciousness, sort of. A community sprouted up, at least, which I know you were instrumental in helping to get together, but there still was isolated work on consciousness going on, just, I guess, not
Right.
explicitly. Yeah, Michael Gazzaniga was talking about the interpreter theory of consciousness as a result of split brain and stuff like that.
That's right. Yes. There was a lot of work. It tended to be somewhat intimidated. In much the same way that if you were going to talk to Queen Victoria about breeding horses, which people did, I think she was interested in horses, then you somehow had to circumvent the actual mechanics of mares and stallions and so on. So you had to talk around it, and that turns out to be quite harmful, because if you cannot use the truthful word for the thing that you're interested in, then you're very severely handicapped, actually more handicapped than I ever realized.
Hmm.
There's a kind of hole in your mental world, and you share that hole. So I remember quite a few times talking to other people in psychology, academic psychologists who often did very, very good work with a direct bearing on consciousness, and mentioning the word consciousness to them, and they would not hear the word. It's very, very interesting. I imagine just like saying the word sex to maybe not Queen Victoria, but Prince Albert, her consort, who together helped to produce the babies, and how they managed to do that without the right vocabulary, I have no idea, but they certainly did. And it was the analogy is actually quite close, because human groups produce taboos. As far as I can tell, maybe all groups produce taboos, and certainly the groups that I know about develop their own taboos. It's this very strange social phenomenon, because it is kind of a blind spot in the shared knowledge that you hope to have about the relevant world.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about that as well, since we're talking about the sort of origins of consciousness science, and you were instrumental in getting this a group together that shared an identity in this way with the ASSC and the
Right.
Consciousness and Cognition Journal. I wonder what is your feeling about the state of consciousness science currently? Do you think it's healthy at this point? Is it thriving, or do you think there's anything to be worried about?
Well, there's always something to worry about.
Yeah.
And I think being able to use the word sex and to use it frankly, and to study it, and to treat it as not a very dangerous thing, as the implicit idea was during the Victorian period, at least the story that we hear about the Victorian period, which is probably
Right.
not the real thing anyway, but
Yeah, exactly.
but it's close to the truth. And basically, if one used the word sex in the wrong social group and so on, you would be never invited again.
Right.
Or you would be consigned to breeding horses or whatever. So there would be severe social penalties for violating the taboo, and this appears to be true in all the anthropologically studied cultures that I know anything about. And the taboos are very often quite invisible to people. So the people who observe the taboo with great care and considerable anxiety are the very same people who would deny the existence of the taboo. And this is sort of a very Freudian idea
Right.
because the notion of censorship, when Freud lived in Vienna, Vienna was the capital, as you know, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the censorship office would be part of the standard bureaucracy of the empire. And if you wanted to publish a newspaper, which would be a print newspaper, of course, at the time, around 1900, you would first walk over to the censor's office and make sure that your first first proof of the printout was approved by the censor, and then if the censor forbade the publication, there might be a white space where you just couldn't print anything, and you didn't have time to reset all the lead type. So sometimes I believe that censorship was really very clear. And because everybody gossiped in that kind of world with each other, everybody really knew about the censorship, and they drew their conclusions. So if a certain prince of the court was not mentioned in this particular issue of the Vienna People's paper, I think that was roughly the title of the paper, then everybody would start speculating hotly whether that particular prince was out of favor and why, and what terribly offensive things he might have done. The same kind of thing that happens in Washington, D.C., of course, all the time, and in other centers of human power and politics and society. Taboos appear to be universal, and I do not know what the current theory is from sociology and anthropology on why we have taboos, but there's no question that human groups create taboos. In the case of science, of course, that's a kind of a suicidal thing, because if you were Isaac Newton and you were not allowed to talk about gravity, you would be lost. You would have no way to write F equals ma, the famous formula, where F is force and m is mass and a is acceleration, and gravitational force is one kind of F. So that's a crucial formula in the history of physics, and it essentially created classical physics. If you make something a taboo, and it does happen in the sciences are not free of this sociological phenomenon. It does happen in science, and when it does happen, you're crippled, basically.
Right.
You can't do what you claim to be doing.
So do you think that's currently, there is a taboo about consciousness in science currently, or not? Do you think that's
I
changed?
think we're still having residual taboos because in the old days, you would be punished in terms of professional punishment, because behaviorism, which explicitly denied the existence of consciousness, starting with John Watson in 1912, that was the progressive era in the United States, and it was kind of a revolutionary era, and the behaviorists were revolutionaries and overthrew the prior psychology of William James being my hero. I get to criticize William James, but nobody else does.
Okay,
Uh,
right.
that's not quite true. But William James was a fabulous psychologist. His brother Henry was one of the great pioneers in the stream of consciousness movement in literature.
Oh, I didn't
And
know
of
that.
course, the family, his dad, Henry Sr., his brother Henry, and William James himself, and perhaps Alice, who was unfortunately, she was very obviously intelligent and talented. I don't think she got much of an opportunity to flower at that time, the way Emily Dickinson did, for example. Emily Dickinson lived just right down the street, I think, from the James's house in Cambridge, Mass. So at that time, women were in a very, very difficult position, especially if they were talented
Right.
and had ambitions to be recognized. So it was that kind of a time, but William and Henry were essentially able to found a very influential philosophical and psychological movements centered on the issue of consciousness. And then behaviorism came along in 1912, 2 years after William James died. He died in 1910. 2 years afterwards, John Watson proclaimed the Behavioristic Manifesto, as it
Right.
was called. I think he was president of the American Psychological Association, and politically it became impossible at that time, or severely discouraged,
Yeah.
to use the word consciousness, and not just the word consciousness itself, but all the English vocabulary words that refer to consciousness, which is about, I believe it's more than half of the vocabulary words of English. So this was an extreme puritanical taboo that handicapped people who wanted to seriously think about. After all, this is a traditional issue in human philosophy, going back as far back as we know in recorded history of philosophy, 25 centuries in the case of classical Greece.
Right. And
And
even
about the
further back
same.
in like, for instance, Indian philosophy, Hindu,
Exactly
Buddhist
right.
philosophy.
Yes, in Indian philosophy, it may go back even earlier.
Right.
So, in
I mean,
Indian
so
philosophy,
I
yeah.
guess like for Skinner, I mean, I'm not a behaviorist, obviously, but Skinner famously said that, there may be these inner episodes, but they don't play any role in the explanation of behavior. So
Something like that. Skinner, you have to understand that Skinner was kind of a split personality. And this is not my claim, it's Skinner's own claim in his 2-volume autobiography, which he published in 1975,
right.
in which he simply describes how he went through a very traumatic period as an adolescent, but his real ambition in life was to become a stream of consciousness novelist.
Really?
And he spent 4 years at Hamilton College being deeply educated in the stream of consciousness literature of that time. And he was really quite good at it, had great ambitions. And then the family encountered very severe problems. His older brother died. His father lost his job as a coal company attorney. Skinner himself went into a deep depression because he could no longer fulfill that ambition to become a stream of consciousness novelist. And at the end of what Skinner himself calls his dark year, which is significant, he becomes a radical behaviorist, which means someone who, in a very nuanced way, because he was very intelligent and
Right.
knowledgeable, who denied, let's call it, the psychological usefulness of the very word consciousness. And this is quite dramatic, and it's sort of pathological, but it's within the normal range of pathology, because adolescence is a very, very difficult period for maybe most human beings.
Yeah.
And in modern times, especially because we don't have a set of guidelines which traditional cultures offer for young people. And if you follow the guidelines reasonably well, then you end up being an accepted member of the tribe or whatever. We lost that, and so Skinner and others, Watson, John Watson himself as well, William James suffered from had very painful episodes worrying about free will, for example.
Right.
The 100 years prior to 1900 were very much obsessed with religion, and religion. The key idea of religion was the soul, and the soul was one word for consciousness.
Right.
So we're talking about a kind of a culture war here that went on for at least 100 years, probably longer, but kind of culminated right around 1900.
So I'm someone who's watching along out there. Jay Richardson is asking how guilty we think people like Jerry Fodor were in maintaining this taboo. Fodor was a philosopher. I think that's an interesting question because I do wonder to what extent you think philosophers were complicit in this kind of behaviorist tabooizing of consciousness. People like Quine.
I love to accuse the philosophers. uh, uh, but on the other hand, there's philosophers and philosophers, right?
Yeah.
Bertrand Russell, who was one of the founding members of the Labour Party in Britain, which is the Social Democratic Party, Bertrand Russell was very much a revolutionary, and he believed that what he would have called the soul of religion was a harmful concept. It kept people in submission to the tyranny, whatever the tyranny of the day was. It was either capitalism or the bourgeoisie or the monarchy. There were still monarchs at that time, of course. They still had considerable power. There were emperors. But in any case, it was a transitional period that led to a genuine revolutionary period. In the United States, we called it the progressive era, and it has its own pros and cons that we can talk about. Some very bad things were done, and some very good things were done. In Europe, Western Europe especially, it was social democracy, which essentially took over. And in Russia, of course, the Russian Revolution took over and created absolute mayhem for decades after that. So this was, plus World War I was going on with an extremely destructive effect on the younger generation in Europe and even in America to a lesser extent. It was a tremendous time of destruction and also a time of creativity. Bertrand Russell, I think, played an enormous role in all this and essentially endorsed John Watson's book called Psychology from a Behaviorist Point of View.
Right.
And this made Watson famous because Britain at the time, of course, was the center, the intellectual center of the English-speaking world. And having your book being celebrated by Bertrand Russell, there just wasn't anything better than that. So now there were others. Alfred North Whitehead, who was Russell's co-author on the famous Principia Mathematica, the great book of novel logic, propositional logic. Alfred North Whitehead was very much on the other side from Russell. And Whitehead, one of my favorite quotes in the world, is Whitehead's saying that nature has no departments. And I believe that is what we are seeing. We are seeing that there is no psychology department separate from a philosophy department, separate from a biology department. They are all the same aspects of nature. Even philosophy, I would argue, although philosophers will no doubt argue against that.
Well, I won't argue with anything, but I think the point is interesting because, like you're saying, with Russell endorsing the behaviorist paradigm, which I wasn't aware of, but then even there's Quine, who, in Word and Object, and I don't think he really believed behaviorism, but he was willing to say, well, here's an empiricist theory of how the mind could work, and you have people like Gilbert Ryle. And then also, I don't know how familiar you are with the work of Jerry Fodor, but I think the question that was being asked about Fodor is apt because even though Fodor is probably one of the most influential philosophers of the contemporary period, especially crossing over into the psychology and cognitive psychology disciplines, he explicitly avoided talking about consciousness, and his whole representational theory of mind left consciousness out. He didn't think that you could really address that issue.
I think that is exactly right. And that is this oddity of, let's say, your Queen Victoria, and one of your publicly well-known hobbies is dogs and horses, and children, of course. And here you are. Every word you say is carefully checked by your courtiers and your PR people, essentially, and turns into public pronouncement. And people really guide their lives
Right.
by the model of the Queen. And yet you cannot pronounce that three-letter word. And what is the effect that this has on people? Well, people obviously imitated her. People started to wear, women started to wear black dresses, for example, because the Queen was in mourning for her dead husband, the Prince Consort, and she was in mourning for 40 years or something, a very, very long time. And that became the fashion of the age, not just in England, but really around the world. So the Queen was enormously important as a model, and in somewhat similar fashion, the evasion of the very word consciousness, and Jerry Fodor, I think, is a late product of the taboo.
Right.
So he came during a transition period, and I personally have never asked either Noam Chomsky or Jerry Fodor or people who knew them well why they evaded what seems to us to be so obvious. It's a very great paradox, and I think one of the reasons was that the word itself was just explosive. It would get you nothing but trouble. And George Miller, who's my idol at that time, was a very great psychologist,
Right.
wrote about it very, very beautifully, wrote the first history of psychology that actually dealt with both the consciousness side and the anti-consciousness side of 20th century psychology. And I think Miller really had the definitive take on all that. But even Miller was not listened to very much in terms of his little history that he wrote, which, by the way, I should mention the title of Miller's history. It's called Psychology, the Science of Mental Life.
Wow.
And those were fighting words.
Fighting words. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
No, science of behavior.
Exactly, right. And so it's very, in retrospect, human beings, as you know, of course, have talked about consciousness for as far as we can trace back. The words for consciousness and the conscious senses, for example, vision, hearing, touch, smell, taste, those are conscious senses. They emerge in the cortex exactly, or somewhat like we expect the conscious senses to emerge in our own subjective stream of consciousness. Right. So people knew about that. They had no particular trouble with it. They interpreted consciousness both as an otherworldly mystery, but also as a very practical thing. So if you were teaching your child to shoot a bow and arrow or to throw pebbles to bring down rats or mice or moles or something like that, some animal that you could bring home to the family to feed them for the evening, which was crucial. Obviously, people would starve without that. So all those things, accuracy, conscious accuracy, was crucial in all those very, very fundamental hunter-gatherer habits that humans developed really, really to a very high level, much like baseball pitchers today, for example, extreme skill at those things. So consciousness was simply part of that discussion. You would tell your child, or your child would tell you, oops, daddy, you missed that one, and everybody would laugh at you and you would be ashamed, and the family would complain that they didn't have dinner, or they didn't have meat for dinner that night. So, so there were consequences of being wrong in regard to your conscious sensory and sensory motor actions. And this is not even talking about being a good member of the tribe and following the customary expectations of the tribe, and not running out on your lover, and so on. So human beings inherently, by virtue of the fact that we do have a rather stable human nature that is stable across cultural divisions, by virtue of that fact, we are inevitably obsessed with consciousness.
Yeah, so I would just mention also about Fodor that by the end of his life, he was talking about consciousness, at least privately, to people. I know he argued a lot with David Rosenthal about this, and apparently endorsed like a kind of representationalism about consciousness. But I do wonder if to be a little bit fair to these guys and their cohorts, if maybe some of the reason why there was this taboo was because there was a perceived crisis in psychology at that time of it not being serious. And so the introspectionism, the period of the time before, it led to these intractable debates about, what does a circle look like, an oval, or, what is tilted? Does it look like an oval or a circle? And people, the imageless thoughts debates, just, epicycles and epicycles. And so there was a concerted effort to say, well, what we need to study is something observable, and that's behavior. And so they threw the baby out with the bathwater, but I think it came from a place of saying, we got to make psychology respectable. And they maybe overcorrected a bit, but would you agree that was a large part of the motivation?
It's a really interesting point. It's certainly, to some extent, as an undergraduate at UCLA, I was educated by people who were skeptical behaviorists, or I should say, who were self-doubting behaviorists. And I never fully understood, because after all, what do you understand as a first-year student? Exactly. Not very much. But my teachers, certainly my first professor, who was marvelous, who was the greatest professor I've ever had, perhaps, Alan Parducci, he was profoundly aware of both sides of that issue. So as a scientist, he had to work within the constraints of behaviorism, and he had to observe behavior and present public stimuli and so on, which he did very beautifully. And he came out with a very profound understanding of what was called adaptation level theory. Adaptation level is basically the way we, for example, the way a car salesman will first tell you about the really, really expensive car that you can't afford, but it has all these goodies. So first gets that into your consciousness, and that primes you then to say, well, I can't afford that one, but maybe, and then he'll give you the next one because he set the context, right?
And it's still higher than you would have initially gone.
Exactly right. So salespeople use this all the time, and there's a pretty clear psychological theory for it that I think came out of Gestalt psychology initially, but then became very useful under the experimental work of people who had to work within the behavioristic paradigm. So yes, one of the interesting things about that time is everybody knew about sex, but nobody talked about it. And what's more, they shaped their research programs around sex, but still didn't talk about it. And so you get this very interesting ambivalence. This whole thing is very reminiscent of Freud, because Freud's notion of censorship, of course, going back to Vienna and the Kaiser in Vienna, the Austro-Hungarian Kaiser in Vienna, what would happen, of course, is that people were constantly trying to interpret the hints and the blank spaces
Right.
that they heard from the palace, and this is essentially Freud. Freud applied that kind of socio-political metaphor to the human mind. And it turns out to be a very, very interesting and revealing. It's not the only way, obviously, to look at the human mind, but it's one of the important avenues toward getting a deeper understanding of the mind. So I think I think Freud, in a sense, did the obvious thing, but what seems obvious to us, of course, is not obvious to people at that time. It took a great deal of courage to actually talk openly about the censorship, including the censorship that human beings impose upon themselves.
Right. So now, I mean, now we're post taboo in some sense, although I do wonder. So even though there is a kind of concerted effort, there's, several organizations devoted to this. There's journals devoted to the study of consciousness. The ASSC now has the Neuroscience of Consciousness journal, but still there's a hope, a quest for people like me would like to see the science of consciousness join the sort of legitimate fields of neuroscience, like what happened with attention. So, the attention used to be sort of ostracized, and then at a certain point it became very serious. Now everyone does attention, and consciousness hasn't reached that level yet. And there's some people think maybe a danger that it's backtracking a bit, and conferences that used to be more scientifically oriented, like the science of consciousness in Tucson, are now open to all sorts of non-empirical or someone might argue non-empirical orientations and stuff. So that's what I was asking a bit earlier, is I wonder if you think the science of consciousness is a healthy endeavor at this point, or if it's so if we're sort of, the taboo has gone too far the other direction to the point where everything is up for grabs, and therefore it's also in danger of not being taken serious outside of.
Well, I just published a big book called On Consciousness.
Oh yeah, you mean this giant book,
which contains sort of a slimmed down version of everything I've done over the last several decades, and it develops things almost to today. Books take time to write, obviously, so there's always a lag in the system, but it's about as good as I can do. And after I finished it, I started to read the proper translation of Aristotle's book, which is sometimes called De Anima, or it's called On the Soul, or in Greek, I think it's something like Peripsyche, where psyche is the Greek word for mind, and all conceptions of mind, historically, I think, implied consciousness. They were very clear. In fact, Descartes thought that consciousness was the only thing there was in the mind. There was nothing unconscious.
Right.
And Descartes was one smart dude, right? So Descartes' view on this was, of course, deeply scholarly and very thoughtful. And the fact that he thought that only consciousness existed in the mind is indicative, I think, of a great deal of Western thought, not just at that time, but prior to that. In any case, it turns out that a modern scholarly translation of Aristotle's book is on consciousness. And so accidentally, I bumped into, for obvious reasons, actually, I bumped into Aristotle's title, which in a sense started the naturalistic study of consciousness in the Western lineage of ideas. And of course, then we have Plato as well. We could talk about Plato. There's so much to say about Plato.
Definitely.
And I think Plato communicated very directly with the Indus Valley culture of the time. And we know, in fact, that they overlapped in time. So Plato's notion of consciousness is the Maya notion of Indian philosophy, which is essentially that consciousness is a hallucinatory or delusional thing. Maya means that which is not. So that very profound philosophical history kind of merged with the Western tradition, and we lost track of that. But I believe that's true, actually.
Interesting. So I have a question coming in from another person viewing over here named Luke. He wanted to ask you about the global workspace theory in particular, and whether you thought that the functionalism involved in global workspace theory continues in some sense the taboo of about talking directly about consciousness.
Only in the minds of certain philosophers, I think. And that's because philosophy, since 1900, philosophy in the English-speaking world has been as tightly self-disciplined in its own way as behaviorism was. And there is a considerable question in my mind. I'm not a philosopher. I know a little bit about philosophy, but I depend upon you to tell me about the things I do not know. So I think they painted themselves into a corner. And that's true of Russell. I think it's true of Wittgenstein. I think it's true of Ryle. And the others, I do not know well enough.
Do you think it's true of like Dennett, who is a student of Ryle?
You know, it's very interesting. I think Dennett has broken the mold in very interesting ways. And I've learned some very profound things from Dennett's writing. And I think he sort of spun those very interesting ideas off almost in passing to his major point, but his little epigrams that he inserts at various points are sometimes even more interesting than the major thrust of his books.
Interesting. Okay.
And the particular quote that I remember from Dennett, by the way, is a quote that says, "Consciousness is that to which I have access." And then he italicizes the word I. And that brings in this very traditional idea that goes back to 6,000 years to Proto-Indo-European languages, because the Indo-European languages, every single one, as far as I know, make a major distinction between I as subject and me as object of a verb. That's a philosophically very profound idea. I don't know where those people got the idea, probably from even earlier human languages, I suppose. Or maybe it's just part of the praxis, the everyday practice of yelling at your kid when they miss the rabbit with their pebble and saying, "You failed," and that gives you, and then the kid has to say to himself or herself, "I failed, but not me failed," because that doesn't have quite the same meaning. So it's possible that early language users, human beings who developed language from very early on, a couple of 100,000 years onward, according to recent archaeological guesses, human beings may have worked out the praxis of language before they figured out that I was different from me. I really don't know, pure speculation, but it is certain that they made that distinction.
Yeah, and so that quote that you were talking about, Den, it brings up an idea that I wanted to ask you about. So it's talking specifically about the global workspace. I mean, you didn't really finish your thought about, you said, in the mind of certain philosophers, maybe.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Global workspace.
Look, global
Workspace.
in science, we don't have complete theories. And in fact, I've been emailing a friend who's a really very good particle physicist. And he's very frustrated because he can't come up with the final particle, right? So you've got this beautiful system, and you've got string theory, you got this, and all these very, very smart people talking to each other in advanced mathematics and so on.
Right.
And they can't figure out how to finish the system. And that means that physics, even very advanced physics, and physics is our model in a sense of what science could become. It is the most celebrated, it's the most mathematically profound, and all those kinds of things. And of course, it's immensely practical and powerful, and presents us with nuclear weapons, among other things.
And fMRI machines.
And sorry? And fMRI machines, absolutely. Right. Physics has played a huge role in the brain imaging and the medical imaging revolution, which has been so important, continues to be very important.
Right.
In any case, so my friend, the particle physicist, is very frustrated. And now this is interesting to me because right around 1900, as you know, of course, there was a great deal of confidence in the physics community before 1900, right? That they had the answer. They had all the answers. It was only a matter of doing a little bit more work.
Yeah, and then there were two small revolutions that happened.
A little bit more work, and then Einstein came along and blew it all up. And then what's worse, Einstein introduced the Einsteinian universe, the time-space continuum, and the very profound notion of this universe that, in a sense, bends in on itself. And then Einstein himself was shocked to realize that there were quantum phenomena at a very, very basic level that he could not deny. And they were probabilistic rather than deterministic. And Einstein loved the idea of determinism and could never really come to terms with it. Wrote a very famous paper, as you know, showing that quantum mechanics led to an inconceivable paradox. And then the inconceivable paradox turned out to be true. So, so the whole history of science is not just physics, it's also mathematics, by the way, because mathematics has gone through similar revolutions that were totally unexpected and happened right after people thought they finally had their stuff together. And then somebody comes along, Gödel comes along and shows that you can't have a demonstrably complete mathematics at all. And this violates everybody's intuitions. So this is a very interesting phenomenon in the history of human ideas, and this very odd and frustrating, both very beautiful and very successful science and mathematics, and then followed by some kind of revolutionary development that nobody expected, that suddenly throws a spanner into the works. And I don't know which is more fundamental. You know, is it the successes of science and mathematics that are more fundamental? Or is it these near successes that that trigger a paradigmatic change of some kind.
Right. Yeah, interesting. So is your idea, I mean, because the question was about global workspace theory and
Yes, let me
whether,
backtrack actually. Global workspace theory is a scaffolding. Just as Freud described his own thinking as a scaffolding, which means it's a step. And it gives you, if you're lucky and you work hard, it gives you a basis for trying to build a wall. And the wall can be the outer wall of a house. And first, you need to build the scaffolding and test it to make sure it's stable and so on. Global workspace theory, in my use of it, and I think the others who have developed it very, very beautifully, by the way, would tend to agree with this. Certainly the scientific types, the empirical people would, particularly Stanislas Dehaene in Paris,
uh-huh.
and Jean-Pierre Changeux, and a number of others, because scientists, I think, don't think in terms of complete theories that are the final answer. I certainly don't.
Except your physicist
Global
friend.
workspace theory is a scaffolding. And it turns out to be very handy scaffolding. And there are interesting historical reasons for that also, because it turns out that metaphors for something like a global workspace are extremely ancient in the
Right.
history of human ideas and long precede probably the invention of writing systems, of written scripts and so on. And there are plausible reasons for that, but they're speculative. In any case, I think the notion of a conscious mind or brain that both unifies and broadcasts, if you will, uh, um, whatever it is that comes to consciousness. I think that idea appears in William James, for example,
Right.
even though he really resisted the idea of unconscious intelligent processing. So, but just by virtue of the fact that he was so brilliant and just kept on babbling to himself, he just wandered into these very interesting ideas.
Yeah.
So
So
I don't think it's a particular person's invention. I think it's the possession of thinking people, probably for much longer than we can know. And so yes, it's a scaffolding, and that means we can look to the next stage.
right.
And for me, the next stage, of course, was a sudden wave of evidence about the brain, and particularly the cortex, that started to really clarify very beautifully. The first version of the theory was published in 1982, actually, believe it or
Oh
not.
wow. I didn't know that.
Uh, and because it was compelled by the evidence we had, which was so paradoxical, and this seemed to be an answer to the paradox that we all encountered, really. And then the brain evidence started to come in more and more and more. And of course, the psychological evidence kept on coming in as well. And via computer science, the information sciences, we started to have a much deeper set of concepts, which essentially express themselves in the World Wide Web and in things like deep learning and so on, tools that are now being used. But the mathematical basis was worked out, started to be worked out around 1980.
Right.
So all at the same time, these ideas were coming in and things were becoming plausible that nobody ever took seriously before. So, it's one of these things where it's an intersection of thinking people with the time in which they live and the ideas that are sort of floating around at that time.
Right. Yeah, I think part of the question that was coming in was about whether global workspaces, as a theory of consciousness, is perpetuating a kind of taboo about speaking about consciousness. And I think the core idea there was the distinction between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, and whether you take yourself to be giving a theory of phenomenal consciousness or a theory of something else, or how
Yeah,
you feel about
I've
that
never
distinction.
see. I don't divide the world up in. I don't divide the world up. I'm sort of a Whiteheadian, I suppose, in that respect, because I really think that nature does not have departments. And my experience in the last several decades points to the same conclusion. I think that's our common experience, actually, over the last several decades, because brain science used to be totally separate from psychology, which used to be totally separate from philosophy. Well, that's
Right.
absurd. That's absurd
Totally.
because you go back to Aristotle, you go back to Plato, you go back to Socrates on the western side of the Eurasian continent, and you get a certain extraordinary tradition, a very profound tradition, and Hippocrates, of course,
Right.
was alive at that time with his medical school on the Greek island of Kos, and made very important discoveries about the brain and about the epilepsies, which are still being studied today, very important source of information about consciousness. And Socrates may have been a mild epileptic
Huh.
because he had these absence seizures. And it's very unclear, and I don't know if the science even makes a distinction right now, the medical
And he does
science.
talk about his daemon, which may have been like an inner voice guiding him in some cases.
Exactly,
Like,
right.
yeah.
And his daemon was the source of intuitive wisdom, perhaps, or wisdom, the reasons for which he could not explain at the time when he had those insights, maybe something
Right.
like that.
Yeah.
But at the beginning of the symposium, Plato shows Socrates getting lost on the way to the drinking party,
Yeah.
as you know. And there's two guys that are following Socrates, and they see him getting lost. And one asks the other, "Should we, grab him by the shoulder and make sure he gets to the party or not?" And the other one says, "No, don't worry about it. He'll show up." Because he goes into these states of absence, and there are low-level epileptic seizures that are called absence seizures. On the other hand, people do get deeply engrossed and deeply preoccupied with questions, and I'm very unclear at this point. I have to talk to somebody who understands this better. What the difference is between normal absorption that we all experience and this very low-level epileptic phenomenon.
Right. But so, I mean, this wonderful book of yours is called On Consciousness. And so it sounds like what you're saying is that you don't want to make distinctions with, like,
Well,
access
certainly
conscious,
not
phenomenal conscious.
no distinction between access and phenomenal and experiential or phenomenological aspects of consciousness. Empirically, what you have is a continent, and you don't know how to slice up the continent. God doesn't put labels, museum labels, on the different parts of the continent and say, this is Louisiana, it belongs to the French.
Right.
And that South America belongs to the Portuguese or the Spanish or whatever. Those labels emerge sometimes because human beings decide on divisions and fight over the boundaries and all that kind of stuff. It's not nature that creates that. So I'm sort of a naturalist. I'm sort of an Aristotelian, really, because I'm trying to understand the nature of this phenomenon. And I think we can say that the experiential aspect of sensory perception, for example, which I need to ask you about, by the way, because I do not understand what your colleagues in philosophy have been saying about sensory consciousness. So I need your help with this. But in any case, sensory consciousness is very closely wedded to visual imagery, for example, but imagery is endogenous. It comes from the brain itself. And it was shown quite a long time ago, actually, by very good experimental psychologists, that you can confuse images with visual stimuli, visual
Right.
events that rise to consciousness. And that very similarly, you can confuse inner syllables, syllables that you only tell yourself. So you can hear them in your inner ear, if you will. That's not the right word. But you're in your auditory cortex, essentially. It's generated by the brain itself. It can be done voluntarily. You can, if I ask you to rhyme the word rhyme, that's a hard one. To in your inner speech, rhyme the word speech with another word.
Yeah.
And I'll bet you can do it. I haven't even thought through this one, by the way. So this is a
Yeah.
pure guess.
Reach, teach.
Yes, teach, of course. And now, introspectively, because introspection is really important, sometimes very, very accurate. Sometimes not accurate at all, but it can be very accurate. So, introspectively, would you tell us about your subjectivity and whether you think that you rhymed the word speech with teach even before you pronounced it?
So the idea is you say you give them a word, you ask them to rhyme it in inner speech, and then you ask, was it rhyming before you sort of said it in inner speech?
Yeah, that's one way to approach it. And what would be, no, tell me about the privacy of your conscious mind as you remember it after I asked that question.
Yeah, I would say that it sort of happened immediately.
Yes, that makes a great deal of sense. And as you know, psychologists in the 50s and 60s and 70s spent an inordinate amount of time studying exactly that. It was
Right.
talked about in terms of the confusability of syllables, but they were mentally pronounced syllables, but you were not supposed to say that. But it was, in fact, inner speech, and we now know because we can observe Broca's area and Wernicke's area during inner speech, and we can tell the difference between conscious and unconscious speech and so on. So we know so much more about it. It's much more that the whole question is much better constrained by multiple lines of quite good evidence.
Yeah.
And as you know, of course, we did not use I certainly did not use the word inner speech or use the word consciousness at that time.
Right.
It was not the right way to talk.
Yeah.
And
So
so yes, look, global workspace theory is a crutch for thinking about reality. And I'm very persistent and very old-fashioned in believing that there's such a thing as truth, and there's such a thing as the ability that human beings have, some of the time at least, to learn what is true and to do it so well that we can even convince each other that some proposition is empirically true in the world, and the world includes other people's minds and my own mind for that matter. So I see, this is Whiteheadian. I see a single nature to the best of our knowledge, of course, and our knowledge is always limited. But we have these tremendously wonderful surprises, the Einstein surprise, right? Where he said the miraculous thing about the universe is that it's understandable.
right.
And I think what that meant for him is that he saw two separate lines of evidence converging very, very exactly in a sort of miraculous fashion, a fashion that was not really up to him as a scientist or up to the other scientists. It was something that emerged from outside of one's own wishful thinking.
Right.
And I think that's a repeated experience that empirical scientists have. Mathematicians have their own version of it. And maybe philosophers have their own version of it. I would guess that philosophers do have their own version of this as well, that suddenly two lines of thought that you thought, that you imagined were quite separate, that they actually come together and converge. And I think
Absolutely.
that's the repeated experience that is 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 persuasive that there really is a nature out there. There is a human nature. There is an extra-human nature as well, and these fields of semantics, these fields of knowledge, um, are surprisingly coherent when you study them very carefully.
So, I mean, I want to ask about what you were interested about the sensory stuff, but I take it maybe from the philosophers at least. So I take it maybe some of it has to do with this debate which has been going on recently in neuroscience about whether a conscious experience is global or local, specifically whether it involves the prefrontal cortex.
Yes,
Uh,
exactly. And I'm interested in that because I got provoked by an interesting article that you know about, uh, and and I feel it requires a response from the point of view that I've ended up in, that I've sort of stumbled into over time, because it wasn't just my doing; it was my doing in combination with one piece of evidence after another, almost every week, almost every day right now. We're seeing really important brain studies uh, with a very direct bearing on the traditional questions of consciousness as well as the modern questions about consciousness. So this is a kind of a golden age. And we have no idea, of course, whether it will actually end up with a coherent viewpoint, but so far things are very encouraging. And so one of the questions appears to be whether prefrontal cortex is necessary or whether it is an after effect of
right.
sensory consciousness, and particularly visual consciousness, because that has been studied in very great detail. And the counterclaim, which I do not believe, is that prefrontal cortex is not, let's call it a precondition for visual consciousness.
So
And this,
what do you make
yeah,
about these like early like patient A, the famous patient A, who allegedly had most, if not all, of the prefrontal cortex surgically taken out, and nonetheless seemingly was conscious? Or so, what do you make of this general claim, which I had Christoph Koch on the week before last or whatever, and he made a big deal out of these kinds of empirical findings that you damage prefrontal cortex, you don't seemingly lose consciousness, but you damage visual areas and you get certain kinds of agnosias, right?
yes.
You get achinotopsia, you get achromatopsia, but it doesn't seem like you get those sort of things when you damage the prefrontal cortex. So I'm just curious of what you make of this kind of argument.
Well, I have a very Platonic point of view on this. And it basically claims that we do have distinctive experiences that emerge in the frontal lobes. And for example, the feeling of effort
Mhm.
is one of them. The tip of the tongue experience activates regions of the anterior cingulate, which belongs more or less to the frontal lobes.
Yeah,
Uh,
it depends on who you talk to. Some people say it is, some people say it isn't. It's a part of the frontal lobes.
I think what you get prefrontally and in the association areas in general, which is the areas outside of the direct sensory projection areas and motor output areas, the association cortex um, seems to, Christoph is using the word hotspots,
Right.
as you know, mostly about sensory consciousness. Well, hotspots appear all the time in prefrontal cortex when you have a tip of the tongue experience, for example. And the tip of the tongue is very easy to elicit. All you have to do is give people ask people an unusual word. What do you call the flying dinosaurs? And if people come up with that one, then you can ask them, well, what else do you call the flying dinosaurs? Because one of those they'll get stuck on.
Yeah,
And as soon
having
as
a
they get
5-year-old, I can report to you there are no flying dinosaurs. There are flying reptiles, prehistoric reptiles, but they were not dinosaurs.
Oh, I stand corrected on that.
I know too much about dinosaurs because of a 5-year-old. Yeah, that's
Well,
basically.
that's great. That's very important.
No, but I take your point though. It's easy to
I will
elicit this.
change. I will change that question. It's very good point. So people have a hard time repeating or retrieving rather fairly rare words, but they know the words. It's
Right.
just they're not instantly available to them, and so they get stuck for a little while, and they know the word, right? They know that they know it. They have the concept. They have fragmentary images, and sometimes they have fragmentary segments, syllables that come to mind. And people are very good at actually telling you the meter of the stress pattern of the missing word, and so on. So they can tell you features of the phonology.
Right.
And
Like,
there are many, and they instantly recognize a mismatch, of course. So if you tell them the wrong word, they say, no, that's not it. Well, if they
right.
can tell you what is the wrong word, then they probably also know what is the true word, and they can also give you fast reaction times to the true word, to the genuine word. So there's all kinds of evidence that converges on the idea that the knowledge is there
Right.
in your brain and mind, uh, and so but it's not immediately retrievable. This turns out to be a meditation technique, by the way, in the Indian tradition. So getting into a tip of the tongue state is actually helpful if you're interested in what is called silent consciousness sometimes.
Interesting.
I think silent consciousness is a useful descriptive term
So,
for.
but Bernie, is what you're saying here that so when it comes to, let's say, non-sensory consciousness, the prefrontal cortex is essential. But when it comes to ordinary conscious sensory experience, it isn't. Or so I'm wondering what you think about that relation. So it would be broadcast somewhere else.
It is such an interesting question. It is a very subtle question because during the tip of the tongue, we do have fleeting sensory events as well. And over a long period of time, there's a very old psychological claim that children, for example, have very vivid visual images and auditory images, maybe music, inner song, inner dance, all those possibilities. And that over time, you get a kind of habituation phenomenon. So that as you get older, and from a Piagetian point of view, as you learn to do formal operations, which is abstraction, and Piaget thought that you enter that stage of intellectual development around age 11, 12, 13. If you are in a French-speaking school in Switzerland, at least, and so these are culturally somewhat biased, but but they are very, very important. Abstraction is the primary ingredient in IQ tests, as I understand it. So as you become more capable of abstraction, the very early evidence seemed to show that you lose the vividness of the images and the inner songs and whatever else you have that brought you to that point. So you throw away your crutches in a certain sense. But artists, of course, and musicians retain that capacity for very important reasons, but they probably have much more refined musical imagery or visual imagery because they keep on developing it, and that's why it stays fresh, of course. So children in this view have very vivid inner feelings, emotional feelings, for example, which we now believe emerge in the insular cortex, also part very close to, well, it's really anatomically part of the frontal lobes. So you have inner feelings, for example, which are very sensory in their original nature, I should say, before you become habituated to them. And then in the process of becoming an adult and in the process of learning to regulate your emotional impulses, for example, which is part of healthy adulthood, you also lose the freshness and the impulsivity and the compulsivity of qualitatively distinct inner conscious contents. So
Right.
there is a story one can tell. It's a life developmental story about the transition from what is sometimes called qualitative consciousness, sensory consciousness in my vocabulary, and the kind of abstractions that mathematicians and philosophers and other people of that kind use for their everyday mentation.
Right. So, but I mean, part of what reason why I'm asking this, because I want to kind of get clear on what role you think the prefrontal cortex specifically is playing in the context of conscious experience and global broadcasting. So I thought that it was the case that at least in the global dynamics updated version of global workspace theory that I guess you published in 2013, so it's been a few years now, but
Right.
I thought the idea was that you could have this any to many broadcasting. So there could be broadcasting to anywhere in the cortex. And so that you should be someone who would be okay with finding
Yes,
out that the
exactly.
prefrontal cortex didn't play a role in sensory consciousness because it maybe broadcast to some other cortical area.
Yes, I don't think there's any question about it. Let me give you an example. David Spiegel in 1985, he's professor of medicine at Stanford, and a very nice fellow, and somebody who's used hypnosis for many years as a therapeutic modality in psychiatry. Um, and he ran a wonderful experiment in 1985 in which he used the event-related potential, which was the only way you had at that time,
Right.
which is sort of the averaged EEG after a certain event that happens at a time that you arbitrarily call time zero. So within a third of a second after time zero, which is the onset of a flashing light, for example, uh, that you can actually observe this voltage change, which travels from the back of the head to the front of the head, well into prefrontal cortex. And now David, as a very skilled hypnotist with very high, with subjects who are highly susceptible to hypnotic suggestion, basically tells them, you'll see a flashing light, which is real, right? And then you'll imagine a box turned upside down over the flashing light, and that means that you won't be able to see the flashing light that well.
Right.
And the question was, will you record in prefrontal cortex this event-related voltage, and will you see it decrease in amplitude as they start imagining this box over the flashing light? And the answer is yes, and it's quite a significant effect. Now, that could be interpreted as a post-conscious phenomenon, which is not very likely. And I just found a nice article that looks at what's called the frontal eye fields, which
Right.
is a very important part of the prefrontal cortex. And the frontal eye field turns out to feed back to visual cortex and to be profoundly involved in conscious vision. And I can explain the reasons for that, but I don't particularly need to. I can simply give you the citation for that, and you can look it up. It turns out that the FEF, the frontal eye fields, get involved in conscious perception before before it becomes conscious, very early on in the process. Our current understanding is that visual events become conscious in an area that's called IT, which is the lower temporal cortex, inferotemporal, and also MTL, which is the hippocampus, the medial temporal lobe. Those are both enormous areas, by the way. They're not little. And what you get, according to really remarkable studies by the French team of Dehaene and Changeux and many co-authors, what you get is this explosion, this broadcast in area ITMTL. And then, of course, there's many other parts of the brain that are very intimately connected because cortex is hugely interconnected. It is extremely difficult to parcellate cortex on a functional basis. You can do it on an anatomical basis,
Right.
Once you pickle the brain. But functionally, within actually working cortex, it's very much like trying to divide the traffic pattern in New York City, for example. You can do it, but it's somewhat arbitrary. And during rush hour, especially, it becomes increasingly arbitrary because essentially it's maybe even better to think about the phone system in New York City because there you don't have traffic jams. The time it takes to go from uptown to downtown and vice versa, that time turns out to be very, very short because of the reentrant nature of cortical connectivity. Cortical connectivity tends to baffle engineers who are very afraid that you're going to blow up a system by getting positive feedback, which is entirely possible. And it's one of the great puzzles about cortex, why it doesn't blow itself up, because you have all these excitatory neurons in one place feeding activity to other excitatory neurons, which feed back their own excitatory activity to the first neuron. And you can do this from just about point A, any arbitrary point A to any arbitrary point B in this cortex, which includes the thalamus. It's called the corticothalamic system. And so Jerry Edelman, who I worked with for quite a long time and was a very profound thinker on these things, I got a chance to chat with him about that, and he and his closest confidants would discuss this, and the general rule of thumb was that cortex seems to operate far from equilibrium, where equilibrium is a thermodynamics term, and cortex, because it is also a physical object in a sense, it also has to obey some of the fundamental thermodynamic constraints that you can't work your way around. So anyway, so the idea is that the cortex always runs very close to instability, which is chaos. And that's a very profound question. I'm a big fan of the work of Walter Freeman and Robert Kozma on that, which is very, very interesting and important. So there are some very interesting hypotheses around for that. And of course, we're always on the threshold of ignorance, which means that if we're open-minded, we're always asking questions and trying to find better answers. And I think that's the status of that hypothesis.
So I am curious because I would have thought that you and like Stan Dehaene slightly disagreed here, but it sounds like you're saying you guys agree. So I'm a little bit curious about that because the sort of global broadcast, as far as I understood, the global neuronal workspace version of it, where that was is that there's these long range neurons that project to the prefrontal cortex, and it's when those are activated that the information propagates into the workspace, which is somehow located roughly in the prefrontal areas. But it sounds like what you're saying
Well,
is that the consciousness occurs in the IT area or the MT areas, which is where the broadcast originates from, but not where it's being broadcast to.
well, I think we're really going back to Aristotle on this.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have visual consciousness, we have auditory consciousness, we have conceptual consciousness, or the consciousness of ideas, as Plato might have said.
Right.
I think those are all valid conscious contents. I think they emerge anatomically in somewhat different parts of the brain, sometimes very predictable. The insular cortex, for example, really, the anterior part of the insular cortex really does have to do with heart feelings, right? Gut feelings that we have, especially as children, feelings like love and hate and fear and disgust and despair and so on, as percept-like feelings that we tend to locate in the heart and stomach area, whether or not they actually exist there. And of course, we know that in cortex, it's the insular cortex that's involved with that. That's the crucial aspect of, and there may also, in fact, there is also heart activation and so on. But it's not necessary. So you could cut that off essentially and still have the feelings in very much the same way that you have phantom limb feelings,
Right.
even after the limb is no longer there. So I think there are a number of anatomical locations that function as global workspaces under certain conditions. And a very beautiful hypothesis has been proposed by Gustavo Deco in a recent paper, which argues that we know the city map of cortex reasonably well by now, and it's called the connectome
Right.
of cortex, which is essentially the street map. It's the structural connectivity of cortex. And then, of course, we have signaling traveling over the structural connectome. So we have traffic. We have to worry about traffic maps, and Fifth Avenue, might have no traffic on a weekend. Let's say, I don't know,
Yeah, right.
but it's conceivable. Let's say.
You haven't been to Manhattan lately, although.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I take your point on that. Or it has too much traffic and it's all
Yes.
stuck. That's also possible. Anyway, so we're really worried about the signaling, and global workspace hypothesis can be viewed as a media hypothesis. So we're talking about not just a theater. The theater metaphor is one of the traditional metaphors, of course, for this, but we're really talking about a brain web. And the structure of the brain web is the connectome. Let's posit that as an assumption.
Right.
And then we have to work out the signal flow. And now the signal flow appears to emerge from certain pieces of cortex. And in the case of the insular cortex, for example, the anterior half of the insular cortex is said to lead to conscious experiences of inner emotions, while the posterior half of the insular cortex does not. So we have what looks like a very inviting comparison case between conscious and unconscious. And that's the crucial thing, of course, from a scientific point of view, because we want to be able to treat consciousness as a variable or observe consciousness as a variable. So in this case, we have body maps. The insula has body maps, which are linked to a vast number of other body maps, including external body maps, which were discovered by Penfield in the 1920s and 30s. The external body maps are separate from the enteric body map, which may be one word that could be used, the gut body map, because there's smooth musculature on the inside of the body and striped musculature in the skeletal muscles. So the innervation and the muscles and the muscle cells and so on are somewhat different from each other. But if you feel nauseous, that conscious feeling is probably emerging from the front half of the insular cortex. So, and that's very interesting, and the evidence is, to me, very compelling. So this tells me something about that expands my conception of whatever may be the brain basis of this informational concept of a global workspace, this media metaphor of a global workspace. And the interesting thing about this, of course, is that the re-entry, the bidirectional feedback
Right.
in the cortical thalamic system is so fast and so explosive that you kind of start scratching your head, and because you want to ask, what comes first, the visual system or the prefrontal system? And if you look at David Spiegel's 1985 hypnosis experiment, what you're essentially telling people is, you're subject in the experiment. I would like you to look at this flashing light, and then I would like you to imagine this box covering the flashing light, so you can only see the box but not the flashing light.
Right.
And that is a prefrontal task because it's voluntary. It involves deliberate imagination. It involves cooperation with the suggestion of the experimenter, all these kinds of things that are very, very likely to be prefrontal, but then prefrontal cortex can mobilize the visual cortex to elicit images, for
Right.
example. And there are good images, there's bad images, there's individual differences, but you find the good images and then you study those to make it easy. Anyway, so where do you want to slice up the traffic flow in Manhattan? Well, it's inherently a difficult question, and the claim in the particular article I just found yesterday is that the frontal eye fields actually get activated before area IT MTL gets activated. And if that's true, and frontal eye fields are profoundly involved in conscious vision, they're necessary for conscious vision for reasons that we know reasonably well. So in that case, a prefrontal cortex is a necessary condition. But you have to remember, a prefrontal cortex is a big place.
Yeah.
And it's not a single coherent, industrial section
Exactly.
of your city. It's a whole bunch of neighborhoods. And they have somewhat different connectivity. They have somewhat different functions. And they might play nicely together, or they might not play nicely together. They might compete with each other. They might reinforce each other, and so on. So I think empirically, with these kinds of questions, you kind of have to be patient
Right.
and look for the best evidence and maybe make a guess and then look for more evidence. It's very much dependent on feedback from nature.
So, I mean, an interesting question is whether you think, given this way you're talking, whether the whole enterprise of looking for the neural correlates of consciousness is kind of making an assumption that they ought not to make, which is that they're going to find some minimal area of cortex or other area of the brain, which is necessary and sufficient for generating a certain kind of experience. Because what it sounds like what you're saying is, and I know you've used this metaphor of like a hurricane before. It's like there's this flurry of activity, which is kind of stable over time, but not localized in any one particular area. And that may be more the type of thing that we're looking for.
Yes, I actually borrowed that from Walter Freeman, who has done really profound work on that question, and who applied nonlinear mathematics with Robert Kozma, his mathematician, to the understanding of the cortical EEG, very important work. And it was Walter who came up with the idea of a cyclone to represent this, because he started to think that standard mathematics, linear mathematics with calculus and so on,
Right.
was not going to do the trick. Because, I assume because this system is so intertwined, it feeds back on itself in so many different ways. It re-enters in Jerry Edelman's vocabulary, and it's so close to chaos. If you think about it in terms of a trajectory,
Right.
and Walter's work and Robert's work shows that there's alternation between organization and chaos about once every 100 milliseconds, which is, again, extraordinarily beautiful result, and I hope it's true. And of course, in science, you always try to be cautious,
Right. Exactly.
right? And then you wait for the next big surprise that you didn't expect. And you try to wrap your mind around it because you're not in charge of this process. Nature's in charge of this process to at least as much as individuals are. And this is the nature of the reality we encounter as empiricists. And I'm not limiting empiricists to scientists.
Right.
I think, if you're a janitor, if you're a good janitor, you're an empiricist. And you better be an empiricist, right? So empiricism is fundamental to the human condition. And you don't have to be a philosopher. You don't have to have a PhD. You don't have to have anything, but you do
Right.
have to be able to survive. So empiricism is basically what we end up doing. And because we fail, whenever we try to take a great leap into the unknown, most of the time we simply fail. And after a while, we get the point, and then we become a little bit more modest and start testing more tractable hypotheses.
So it just occurs to me, it seems like I should have got this sooner, but I'm wondering now, is in the title of Global Workspace Dynamics, the dynamics there is like a dynamical system, nonlinear system, is that what you're trying to invoke with that term there?
Yeah, that word also has many levels, as you know. At one level, it means you're talking about things in motion, and the word dynamics does not commit you too much other than that. But of
Right.
course, the cortex, in terms of adaptability, I think the conscious cortex is the leading edge of waking life adaptation to the world. And the world includes other people, and it includes ourselves. So this is a very common sense view of consciousness. The first thing with your kids that you need to do is to get them to pay attention.
Good luck.
Don't spill your oatmeal, kid. Pay more careful attention and don't fall down.
Well, it's surprising to me, just speaking from experience, I had to tell them that you should walk with your eyes open, looking forward. These are things that they don't want to do. You're like,
that's great.
This is a good idea. Pay attention to where you're going.
There are profound philosophical lessons in that.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it is actually true, I believe, that people with a strong theoretical bent sometimes forget that. And it's kind of amazing. I'm sure I've forgotten it myself. So the theoretical types drift off into word salad. And then they have to be reminded that, if you're a 5-year-old or 3-year-old, you better just look straight to, where you're going to step. It's important.
Yeah. The neuroscientist Tony Rowe, I don't know if you know him or not, but he once told me that when he was a graduate student, he was very interested in consciousness. He wanted to think about theories, and he was asking his advisor about it. And his advisor said, "You're too young for theory. You need to put that on the back burner and just get some data first." So, I mean, I think that's a good point.
I think, by the way, I think that's another taboo, and taboos sometimes have a rationale, and often are harmful.
Yeah. You mean taboo against theorizing?
Yes. Yes. I encountered the taboo against theorizing. I did my homework by running extremely boring experiments for 3 years. And then I decided I didn't have the dogged hard work ethic of real experimentalists. I love what they do. I constantly use what they end up with, but I'm not that. I'm something else. And fortunately, I got rescued by the cognitive science group at that time, which was open to theory.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I mean, we're running short on time here actually, so I can't follow everything. But I am curious about what you're thinking, and someone asked this in the chat too, so it kind of dovetails with what I wanted to ask, and something that we were talking about before we started when we were informally chatting before we started on going online, which is what the distinction between higher order and first order theories. So as far as you understand that distinction, how do you view global workspace theory? Because I view it as a first order theory, or at least as in the way that Stan DeHaan and those guys present it. But I feel like sometimes in the way you present it, it has elements of higher order theory, like the observing ego, for example, being one of those. So I wonder what you think about that distinction.
I think it's extremely difficult to dissociate, empirically dissociate first order theories from higher order theories. And here is an experiment, famous experiment from the Gestalt psychology people, which is simply repeating a meaningful word to yourself, let's say about 10 times.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens, of course, and I'm going to jump to the conclusion here, what happens is that we lose a sense of meaningfulness of the repeated word.
Yeah.
And it's very important for you to repeat your own word, because you get different phenomena when you play it back on your Mac, for example. The voluntary motor control aspect appears to be important to keep the word fairly coherent, but the meaning seems to bleach out, and that is the subjective report, but it's extraordinarily reliable subjective report, and you can do various control experiments for this kind of thing. And these are important phenomena because they are redundancy effects, and redundancy effects knock out consciousness. I think I'll make that as a general claim. If you present a visual stimulus to the eye, and the eye has a jitter on it. It has a tremor on it, which is a functional tremor. It's not pathological in any way. It's functional tremor because it ensures that with every little movement of the eye, which is those movements are not under voluntary control, the edges, the light edges and the color edges and so on, fall on a slightly different population of foveal receptor cells.
You're talking about
and that means that you're constantly feeding new information into your eyes. Even if it's something as subtle as just a shift in the boundary between light and shadow, for example.
Right.
And that's a necessary condition because you can defeat that by mounting a projector, a tiny, tiny, tiny projector on a contact lens, for example, and put in a stabilized retinal image. And what happens is that your stimulus fades, it disappears from consciousness.
Right.
And this is one of a large set of redundancy phenomena that seem to implicate consciousness. And essentially the bottom line is that if a stimulus is not informative, it drops out of consciousness.
That sensory adaptation you're talking about there.
You can, I think the language of adaptation and the language of informativeness is essentially the same. The two ways of talking about the same thing, and I'm sure there are ways we can refine that thought, but that's the initial take I would have on that.
So how does that relate to testing the difference between higher order and first order theories? I mean, because higher order theories are, as just so, as we were talking about before, are just the kind of theories that's posit there's some kind of higher order awareness involved in conscious experience, whereby what that means is a representation of a mental activity and as a sufficient or necessary condition for having a conscious experience. And
Right.
first order theories deny that.
So take any meaningful word, take the word you came up with, speech rhymes with teach, and take either one of those. They both have layers and layers of lexical semantics attached to them. They have feeling tones attached to them, all kinds of additional layers of meaning. And I would argue that semantics, for example, of the word teach is a higher order thought. And that it is conscious because it meets all the basic operational criteria for consciousness, which ultimately come down to accuracy and reportability. So you can reduce those down to your starting operational definition in a straightforward way. And it turns out that the percepts that we encounter, the conscious percepts that we encounter in the visual world, most of them that I see in your office, for example, are quite meaningful. They're meaningful thoughts to me. And even if they were not meaningful, my cortex would tend to turn them into meaningful gestalts, as you know. So that's our bias, to look for meaning in the world, meaning semantic. I'm using meaning as semantics right now, but meaning also has a more profound dictionary interpretation in terms of life meaning and so on. So layers and layers and layers. The events we experience in the world are sandwiches. They are not just the cheese and not just the bologna or the bread. They're whole sandwiches, and they're multi-layered. And all the layers, as far as I can tell, and this is a testable question, all the layers essentially emerge in consciousness at the same moment. Now, again, I realize that this could be false, and so therefore it would have to be tested. And these days, we may be getting to the point where we can actually test that hypothesis. It's very difficult because of the very fine temporal resolution that you would need, those kinds of things. And it goes back to the immense re-entrant capability of the cortex. The fact that you get this resonant explosion, and you can argue whether there's something just before the explosion that is sort of conscious, and it could be, in certain cases, probably certainly true. But we're still dealing with kind of a first order understanding of what the conscious brain does. And so for a first approximation, I'd be happy to say that our perception of the word teach is a sandwich. It's a multi-layered thing.
Interesting. Are you familiar with the work of Jeff Krishmar? Do you know, familiar with that?
I know Jeff, yes.
Someone is asking, Grant Castellou is asking, he says that Jeff claims to have a roadmap to a conscious machine that he got from Gerald Edelman, and he's wondering what your thoughts about this. I know we've talked about AI consciousness before, back there you were skeptical of it. So I wonder if you're still
I've gotten more and more skeptical, actually, over time, which is probably a function of aging. And I can no longer wrap my mind around these ideas. No, I think in decent science, in decent empiricism, whether you're a janitor or whether you're a surgeon, you really have to make a distinction between what's true and what's not true. And I think that the AI hypothesis is unproven at best. And the idea of being able to prove it would seem to imply that you have to understand the evolution of consciousness, which for mammals alone, the neocortex, which is the organ of consciousness for mammals and humans and so on, The neocortex emerged about 200 million years ago. So I'm going to set a high standard here and ask believers in conscious AI to prove to me that the biological consciousness that emerged over the last 200 million years is properly mimicked in an artificial intelligence system. And we're not talking about playing with dolls, because children playing with dolls, they really do believe that they are, they're conscious, they're friends, they have feelings and all that kind of stuff. That's a projection, right? And that's a very natural projection for human beings. We do it very naturally with machines, with computers, and we're wrong. That's all. It's a bias that we have. It's a very charming bias that human beings have to interpret the stars and the clouds in human forms. It just happens not to be true.
So I am curious about this because, the notion of a global workspace is a functional notion. In fact, you got the idea from Alan Newell, who's a computer scientist, and Stan DeHaan wrote.
No, let me just beg to differ on that.
Okay.
Alan Newell was a very important computer scientist. Absolutely right. He was also working for almost a 40-year period, I think, on cognitive architectures. And the fundamental empirical observations that they started to work with in the 1950s was the protocols of chess players as they were thinking through their chess problems. And of course, what they found, they were working with a very good Gestalt psychologist at the time. What they found is that chess players think step by step ahead of time, but they also think in moments of insight. And which are profoundly important, and we tend to neglect them nowadays, of course, which we should not do. They're conscious moments, very important conscious moments. So Alan was both a psychologist. He may have talked with Herbert Simon about economics. He was a great computer scientist. He applied the idea of crowdsourcing or swarm computing or whatever we call it these days, including the global workspace concept. And of course, the global workspace phrase came from his research group at CMU. Very, very important. But he was not he was not a reductionist computer scientist. He didn't think everything came down to bits and bytes.
Right. Okay. But my point though was that the idea of a global workspace is a functional idea. And I know Stan, you don't think so? It's not. Okay. So how is it not a functional idea?
The word functional in the philosophical interpretation, I think, is profoundly misleading. It is used as a kind of reductionistic notion. It's reduction by abstraction, if that makes any sense.
It does.
So
yeah.
Anything that so if you look at a beehive, and you look at the landing platform where the returning bees come back from the field and they carry some pollen and so on, and the other guys or gals are standing around, the guys actually, in the case of bees, are standing around and sampling pollen and looking at the bees dance and so on. That's a global workspace, right? So functionally, the landing platform of a beehive is just as much of a global workspace as our conversation here, which is being broadcast to people who are feeding back their questions to you, is also a kind of global workspace. Those are all global workspaces, but it is profoundly misleading to treat them as a single entity. Computational global workspaces are very powerful. They've entered the toolkit of standard computer science. And of course, they're used routinely for crowdsourcing, for difficult mathematical problems, for example. I'm talking about the biology, And that's what I'm trying to understand. I use whatever hook or by crook, whatever metaphors or whatever math models, all these scaffoldings that are readily available. So if I could, I would abolish the word global workspace theory and turn it into something else. But it's all going to have the same ripple effects and
Yeah.
misconceptions. So I take this perhaps as a chance to correct any misconceptions on that. I'm interested in the biology in the brain and the mind
Yeah,
and
interesting.
subjectivity. It's all grist for the mill because it all goes together in nature as far as we know.
I mean, I think this is another place where you and like Stan DeHaan really disagree, because he recently had that paper in Science where he co-authored with Hak-Wan Lau and Sid Kuder, where they were basically arguing that the global workspace could be implemented in a machine, and that machine would be conscious, because he thinks this is a purely computational functional notion. So it sounds like you disagree with that pretty profoundly, actually.
Totally. Yes,
Yeah.
I think it's a kind of abstract reductionism, and it's just as bad as every other kind of reductionism. And since we are talking about a very profound biological adaptation with an enormous history and a life developmental course and a momentary course in our conversation right here, for example, moment to moment to moment adaptation, very much dependent on the conscious cortex. This is not some abstraction in mathematics or in introductory computer science. This is as profound as any other biological adaptation, perhaps more so than most.
Right. So I'm starting to get the idea more clearly now about the idea how this is scaffolding. This is a useful way to think about things, but it's not. We shouldn't mistake the scaffolding for the structure that we're trying to build.
Right. And once we build a better version of this, we can throw away the scaffolding.
Mm-hmm. Kick the ladder away.
Kick the ladder away. Why not? If you don't need it anymore. So there's no attachment to the words global workspace theory. Certainly not on my part.
Right. Interesting. Well, that clarifies a lot. I really do have to let you go here. So let me just remind people about your own very cool podcast on consciousness, which I listen to regularly, waiting for a new episode to come out. The one with Heather Berlin was very interesting. And
yes.
So I hope you're continuing to do that project.
Yes, exactly. We hope to be going on and grinding out interesting ideas, and it might be possible for us to kick ideas and questions back and forth, you and me, so we can respond to each other's challenges on these things.
That would be very cool. I'm all for that. I always enjoy talking with you. I learn a lot every time I talk with you. It's been way too long since I've had the opportunity to speak with you. So I'm
it has been.
Very glad about that. But just in closing, I wonder if there's anything which you were hoping or expecting to come up which hasn't come up. And the answer can be no, but I just like to check at the end to see if there's.
I suppose a useful cautionary note is that the old saying that the map is not the territory. The map of global workspace theory is not consciousness itself. And if you get that confused, you're going to end up in some other place.
Yeah, exactly. Very good. Well, we need people like you, serious people, theorizing but taking the empirical work seriously. So I really appreciate your contributions. Obviously, you've made seminal contributions, but you continue to do that, and really paying attention to the biology is something that I think is incredibly important and something that needs to be done more.
It's just so much fun. Also, I should tell you that. It's very good to talk with you, Richard.
Thank you.
Nice to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you. So just hang out for a second. I'll say bye off the air, but with that.
Okay.
All right. So